Hey everybody, Pete A. Turner, host and executive producer of the Break It Down show, and we check off a pretty big block today and a personal point of pride for me with our guest. Today we are presenting the brilliant mind and fantastic experiences of Ambassador Dr. Robert E. Hunter, who was President Clinton's ambassador to NATO from 1993 to 1998. And that covers the years that I deployed as a member of NATO to Bosnia. So we have some overlap there. And you think about this, the guy who was the ambassador to NATO, and I ultimately work in the NATO deployment. So you go from all the way from the top all the way to the bottom in terms of Americans. And so that's a pretty neat thing. Look, this is neat. I met Robert at Troy University's conference celebrating the 70-year anniversary of, or the 70-year birthday of NATO, and he was there to speak, and so was Dr. Ledet and myself, Rich Ledet. We all know Rich. After Rich and I did our presentation of religion and just in general sprinkled in our stuff, he made a point of coming up to us first after our presentation and saying that we were worth the price of admission. And we took that as a great compliment and honor. And he and I are fast becoming great friends. I really think the world of this dude, and I'm learning a lot from him. And I just know that you guys are going to find what he says fascinating. His educational pedigree is ridiculous. Fulbright scholar, PhD from London School of Economics. This guy Robert has worked for President Johnson, President Carter, President Clinton. He has written over 1,000 publications for things like foreign policy, foreign affairs, Washington Quarterly, LA Times, Washington Post, blah, 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 on and on and on. He is exceptionally well credentialed. And when he talks about foreign policy, let's just put it this way. Go to his Wikipedia page, or even better, go to his Everpedia page and take a look at his credentials. It is significant, and I'm super stoked to have him on the show. We're definitely going to have more episodes with Robert, and I'm hoping to get him and John McCain in the same room, and it turns out those guys at Circles cross. So this is going to be a real neat exploration. Hopefully you guys dig it as much as I do. I think that you will. Hey, look, if you love what we're doing, then please, by all means, rate, review, share the show. Tell a friend about it. Buy a shirt. Get out there and support the show in these ways. This is how people learn and grow. If you do these things, other people will hear about it, and that will help inch up the audience growth, and that helps us go out and get a little bit of money for the show. So I appreciate you guys' help. You guys know that I'm your friend, and I'm always willing to talk to you. Pete at breakitdownshow.com. I am passionate about charity. We're going to, later this week, I'm going to go talk to the ladies from Charity on Top, and we're going to talk about end-of-the-year giving. And you know I love me some charity, so I'm going to bug you right now about Save the Brave. SaveTheBrave.org is where you go if you want to get involved in some way in addition to or beyond financial. By all means, Pete at breakitdownshow.com. I will get you in contact with Scott or Nick or any of the guys over at Save the Brave, and we will put you to work. We want to help people. You want to help people. Come with us and help us help people. You want to give a little bit of money each month? I promise you can afford it. 10 to 15 bucks. That's all you got to do. Cut back on coffee, or don't cut back on coffee. You got 15 bucks in your pocket. You really will make a difference with that. Okay, I'm going to stop beating you up on that stuff. Just know I'm passionate about it. I put my money where my mouth is, and I put my money where my money is, and my money is going to Save the Brave. This is an incredible conversation. It's going to be a little more than an hour, but I promise you can take it. Here comes Ambassador Dr. Robert Hunter.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland. This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
This is Robert Hunter in Washington, D.C., and this is the Break It Down Show.
I was at the NATO 70th anniversary conference at Troy University, and Dr. Ambassador Robert Hunter was there as well. He spoke, and myself and Dr. Ledet spoke on our topic, and we all got to meet each other, and I thought it would be fascinating to take, Rich and I as the ground truth guys and have a conversation with Robert. Rich is busy today, so he can't do this, but I'm positive we'll have Robert back on again. And I love, Robert, I love bringing guys like you on the show because First off, look, you guys, he has his own Wikipedia page. There's a lot in there. He was the ambassador to NATO for President Clinton. He's got a number of degrees. He's written in everything on foreign policy, from New York Times, The Post, to the Foreign Affairs magazine. He is as well credentialed as anybody can be to speak about. Hey, this is P.J. Turner from the Break It Down Show, checking in real quick to ask you this. John, Scott, and I all support Save the Brave with our time, our location, our effort, and our money. Each month we give a small amount. Do the same with us. Go to SaveTheBrave.org, click on the Donate tab, pick an amount that you want to come out each month, and they will handle all the rest. I stand behind these folks. Thank you so much. Let's get back to the show. Well credentialed as anybody can be to speak about, internet statecraft, really. And he also, look, he sits on a lot of boards and does a lot of things. So first, hey man, thank you for coming on the show and taking this time to kind of talk shop with me about statecraft and how the heck we try to figure out how to work this crazy world that we've got.
Well, I appreciate that and that introduction. That plus $3.65, I can get a cup of coffee at Starbucks.
Well, I've been telling my friends that when you came up to Rich and I after our presentation, you said it was worth the cost of admission, and I was like, but it's free to come. So,
well, there you go.
we're big spenders. So, okay, the thing I want to dive in first is I deployed to Bosnia post the Dayton Accords with the first big push that went in.
Now, were you in the military or civilian, or you what?
I was in the military. I was a counterintelligence agent, so I was going to be on the ground collecting, trying to understand if these accords were going to hold, and find the weapons and find the bad folks and try to get everybody to calm down.
Well, I congratulate you on what you did, because the implementation force, as it was called, and then after it was replaced by a thing called the Stabilization force in Bosnia, and went through the entire time without a single military fatality.
Yeah.
It was an amazing achievement, and I salute you for that.
Yeah, it was a complex time. Yeah, as we deployed, we really didn't have a lot of. We didn't know. Well, first off, no one had this mission sketched out on the mission planning board, and so it's all sort of fell together. At least in terms of our end, within a couple of months, it was like, hey, you guys are maybe going to go to Bosnia. Oh, you are going to go to Bosnia. Hey, welcome to Bosnia. Like within, let's say 4 months' time. And so we literally had no training at all, other than like how to deal with cold weather. They sort of just said.
The first thing you did is you got out a map and said, "What's a Bosnia?"
What's a Bosnia? What the hell? I still don't know what a Herzegovina is.
Well, that's another thing. It was actually two countries that were cobbled together, and the technical term is Bosnia Herzegovina.
Right. Yes. So
as somebody said, the problem with the Balkans is they produce more history than they can consume.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a perfect lay into this question I want to ask you. I always wondered, because we one thing we did learn a lot about, because we had a lot of Serbo-Croatian linguists in our leadership. We learned a lot about the problems of understanding the history and who owned what and who had a claim to what. And it seemed like every time you went back a layer, what you had just learned was all obsolete. But you did learn that this tumult had happened for a long time. So how the heck does Bill Clinton come up with the plan to say, hey, let's go out, let's pick the Serbs as the bad guy? And let me tell you, from the ground, everybody was killing everybody.
Well, it's always a mistake to talk about good guys and bad guys if you're in foreign policy and in diplomacy, unless there's somebody who's really committing aggression.
Right.
If you have to find a way to stop conflict and get people to decide on some things. So one has to kind of put the good guys, bad guys thing in a lockbox and say, if you're an American diplomat, American, quote, policymaker, what's best for the United States? What are we trying to achieve? And how we go about achieving it. And calling people names is not a good way to start. But you make a very good point there. The thing I tell people whenever they get involved in anything abroad, the first thing you have to do is understand where people are coming from. What's their sense of their own history, their own geography, their own culture? How do they think about things? Because if you come in with your big flat feet as an American and don't understand that, you're going to last about 15 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's for sure. And then what we saw on the ground were a bunch of farmers who were just trying to survive and wanting to believe that something better was coming, but had no real recent history that would validate that opinion. They were all convinced that there was going to be more killing and bloodshed.
One of the advantages of being an American in that situation is that we are a society that doesn't take sides in that kind of thing. Unlike the Europeans, all of whom were, or most of whom were involved in one way or another, whether they were in, let's say, in former Yugoslavia, they'd been for Tito in the Second World War, or they'd been for the Croats in the Second World War, that sort of thing. We Americans, there's a certain advantage of being an innocent because we don't come in with prejudices about how we're going to conduct ourselves. And if we're smart, we will then learn from the ground up.
Yeah. Well, you're talking my language there. I was sort of forced to understand that because, we would see all this atrocity and, these homes got blown up in this neighborhood, but not the other ones. And then you recognize that there were different roof styles. The different roof shape determined what family you were, whether you were a Croat, an Islamic Bosnian or a Serb. It was like how they built their homes determined if they got targeted or not. And it was just that simple. And people that were neighbors and had great lives together instantly turned on one another. And so that just tore this whole community apart in so many ways. Like there were still fresh graves on the ground when we got there. People had just been buried, I don't know, a couple of days before when we arrived. It was shocking.
That's correct. Part of the tragedy there was that Sarajevo, about which we've all heard, was prior to the breakup of Yugoslavia and the beginning of the conflicts in the early 1990s, was one of the most successful cosmopolitan cities in all of Europe. And sometimes people didn't even know who the other person was. So it was Serbs and Croats and Bosnians and Muslims and Christians and of different denominations and Jews and all the rest. I mean, they were very successful. And then people got forced by leaderships and their propaganda to start choosing sides, depending on where they might have been 200, 300, 400 years ago. And an awful lot of people died for all the grievances, which unfortunately just got reawakened.
Yeah, it was challenging. But like you said, it seemed to work out. It seemed like everybody was sick of fighting. Would you link the Bosnian conflict to a late post-World War II thing? Was it Cold War? Was it unique? I mean, because as long as Tito was around, he managed to hold everything together.
Tito did manage to hold together a disparate group of nationalities, different languages, different religions, two alphabets, one the Roman alphabet and the other the Cyrillic alphabet, and he imposed his authority, and as long as he was alive, it worked more or less. It was only after beginning with the end of the Cold War that things began to come apart in what was already the former Yugoslavia. And even today, there's no fighting going on at the moment, but there are tensions everywhere. For example, in Kosovo, relations between the Kosovars, who are essentially Albanians, they're essentially Muslim, and the Serbs, who are essentially speak a different language, and they're essentially Christian of one or another a variety of Christianity. And so now they're all stirred up on it. In fact, 200 years ago, there wouldn't have been any Albanians and Muslims in what's now called Kosovo. They came in later at later times.
Huh. Interesting. I didn't realize that.
I'm not so sure you want to talk all about that. We'll be 100 years just talking about that situation. But right now, people are not getting killed. That's the most important thing. It's going to take 100 years to sort it out. And part of it has to do with economic development, where people will get to a point when they start thinking about bread and butter on the table and having some rather than great-grandfather's grievance. You look, for example, here in the United States, we have some of all of these peoples living side by side. You go to Detroit, Michigan, for example, and you'll find Croats and Serbs and Bosnians and et cetera, all living together. And they say it's too bad what's happening over there, but thank goodness we're here. We don't have to think about it.
Yeah. When we look at how we do our intervention, because we seem to want to be, we're sort of really crappy occupiers. We want to intervene to help, but we've proven pretty unreliable at actually delivering that help. When we look at areas to go try to help, whether it's for U.S. interest or humanitarian interest, which we like to do, we struggle at that stuff. We don't like to see kids suffering in Syria, so we think we can help. And gosh, we're really bad at it. Are we learning any lessons with this stuff? I mean, our foreign policy has been so. As a guy that's deployed a lot, our foreign policy has been really problematic the last several presidents.
Well, I think one has to look at individual cases. After the Second World War, where we were deeply engaged in the three enemy countries, Italy, which was smart enough to change sides in time, Germany and Japan, where the United States was deeply engaged, and they have all become great successes, partly because they wanted to do it themselves, but partly because we dealt with them with a fairly light touch and helped them re-engage in the outside world and help them build economically. We had in Europe, for example, in the 20th century, more people died in Europe in the 20th century probably than all other centuries combined beforehand. But in the second half of the 20th century, for a variety of reasons, we've now gotten to the point where if you say to a young German and a young French person, when are your countries going to go to war once again, they'll look at you like you're crazy. They have crossed a threshold, and the United States has an awful lot to do with that. We've done some remarkable things elsewhere. For example, Jimmy Carter, and I had the honor of working for him as well, did broker at Camp David peace between Israel and Egypt, which removed Israel's major strategic challenge. It also took the Arab-Israeli conflict out of the struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union, and that treaty has held ever since. They aren't always the best of friends, but the idea of there being a war between Egypt and Israel is just, now it's nonsense. We were very successful there. We have been successful in some other parts of the world, particularly with economic development, but sometimes, particularly in recent years, we've tended to get a little bit over our heads in what we bite off, and sometimes it comes back to bite us. That's a major reason why, if I may take just a second or two, we need to start off by saying, what's important to the United States? What's in our national self-interest? And then you can add on to that, and that leads us to be involved in certain places, but then adding to that, what we have, since the founding of the United States, seen our role, rightly or wrongly, deriving from the Gospel according to St. Matthew and from the Mayflower Compact of Governor Winthrop way back in 1620, which we often quote, the United States being like the city on the hill. So we have certain values that we see to be universal values. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. And we tend to go around and offering these to other countries. And sometimes we do it in a way where they say, thank you very much. These are great ideas. We want to be Democrats too. We want to have our own lives to lead. But sometimes we do it with a pretty heavy hand, and then everybody gets in trouble. And we're not the only ones who do it. The French believe as long as somebody in the so-called third world speaks French, everything is going to be wonderful. The British believed for all those years, as long as they had what they call the Westminster model of democracy, everything was going to be wonderful. And we've now learned, I think, after a lot of trial and error, that intervention where people don't want your intervention, and when it's not just a matter of stopping a war, if you can, it's something to 2 and 3 and 4 times about before you get engaged.
Yeah, but it's so compelling, right? Like you're like, we can fix this. We, you know, it's gosh, it's yeah. You're right. Where are we wanted, and what do we understand about the people, about like what they need help with? You know, we always bring solutions before we bring questions to their actual determine their problems.
God, we got to make you an ambassador. That sounds pretty good.
Yeah. Well, so here's my question then. We you know, the president is the most powerful man in the world, and they have this giant military. You know, I'll be darned if they know how to keep that thing home. Like, they love to have the military out. And I think President Trump was saying just the other day at a rally that he can't get a straight answer from the Joint Chiefs on how many countries we're actually in. You know, just remarkable that we're so spread worldwide, but then how do you know what you're getting out of it if you don't even know where your people are?
Well, I think we know where our people are. That's unfortunately, we now have military forces in something like 154 countries. I can see a dozen or more, maybe more than that, where it is in the American national interest. But beyond that, and I say this with a certain amount of trepidation because I've had the honor of my entire life, even though I'm a civilian, of working with military people, some extraordinary people dedicated to our country's security. But sometimes I think they have too much money and they have to think about what are we going to do with this money, and that leads them to get involved in other places. The irony is that the non-military aspects of American foreign policy tend to be starved.
Yes.
I was once involved in a study group run by the military, by a Beltway bandit I was helping out, about how the military should plan its next 4 years. They have what they call the quadrennial defense review every 4 years. And one of these generals said, you know, why don't we get the State Department to do some of this instead of us having to do it? And I said, well, General, why don't you do the following? Why don't you just buy the State Department out of Pentagon petty cash?
Wow. Petty cash.
In fact, the military spends about 10 times as much as the State Department. And I have an old rule of thumb. I made this up. I call it the rule of 33.
Huh.
That if you do something with diplomacy, economic aid, propaganda, let's call it that, and you succeed, that's going to, if you have to then end up, because you fail, doing it militarily, you're going to spend about 33 times as much on that. Or, to quote a different source, Jim Mattis, who was the Secretary of Defense for President Trump until he quit over a profound disagreement, he said, you know, if you don't spend enough money on your diplomacy, then you're going to have to spend an awful lot more money on me at the Pentagon to go and straighten things out. So I can't do my job if we don't do our job politically, economically, and in diplomacy.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, in our country, people tend to think of diplomats as just cookie pushers, rather than the people, if they're successful, can keep us from having to send in the Marines. You have to make choices, but an awful lot of times you can achieve things with diplomacy in America's national interest that you wouldn't want to have to try to put American lives at risk with the military.
Yeah, I agree. And one of the things I did want to get into was this exact topic. You know, if we want diplomacy to be, you know, the main way we solve these big problems, you know, clearly going to North Korea is militarily is a possibility, or Iran, but it's a whole lot better if guys like you were solving this problem. And yet the provisions are so far out of whack. Like when I was in Afghanistan, there were, for an entire province, and for those listening, a province is akin to a state. The entire state of, let's say, Iowa. You have, I don't know, 3 people from the State Department there. Now, they've got some additional resources, but that's it. They're supposed to fix all of Iowa in terms of government capacity. And it made no sense to me because I'd go out 2 miles, 3 miles from where they all worked, and I would see a completely different world because I actually was able to see what Afghanistan was really like, as opposed to working just with the governor of the state, and actually talking to the locals. But they had no capacity to do that.
That's why we need 10,000 more people like you, and I know a little bit about what you did in Afghanistan, who were on the ground there. But there is a prior question. The prior question is, what is in the American national interest
Right.
to be in Afghanistan at all? And though we've been there now 18 years, it's still very, very difficult to answer that question, except in terms of, if we weren't there, there are bad guys there who come and do in America what they did on 9/11. I mean, that is a heck of a stretch.
Yeah.
But we're still doing that. And quite frankly, the idea that foreigners, and I include the United States in this, are going to be able to sort out Afghanistan politics is whistling Dixie.
Yeah.
Nobody, beginning with Alexander the Great, has ever been able to do that. The British in the 19th century couldn't do it. The Russians couldn't do it before us. We can't do it because it is it's a tribal society with warlords, and a lot of it's, and as you know better than I do, much better, it depends on different parts of the country, different sects, different religions, different languages, the kind of loyalties. It's not even clear there is a country called Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And I don't, frankly, if somebody said to me, my child, my son or daughter, is being asked to deploy in a military unit to Afghanistan, what are they fighting for? I would have to take a deep breath before trying to say, I really am not quite sure.
Right.
Now, there are other places where it is clear that we need to be involved in fighting for things and working on security. But I don't think Afghanistan is one of them.
Yeah. And when you do look at the things that we try to accomplish, granted, like, we're all trying to do our best, but the ability of, well, heck, let's just be fair. The State Department people, a lot of them have a problem of no accountability at the ground level. They're trying to work, and they're focused on ultimately what the ambassador wants or what the Secretary of State wants. And when you bring in the reality of what the sub-governors, the county governors want and need, I've been in the room, Robert, where the State Department person has scoffed, rolled his eyes, and laughed at the county governor's plan. And I just wanted to throttle the guy by the neck and go, one, you can't insult this guy in his building. Two, this guy has beat people up in meetings before, and if he jumps over that desk and tears your head off, I'm going to let him. And three, just shut up. Let the guy be the boss and work from that paradigm. It just, oh man, it drives me crazy. So even if we do get some of these things right, it's really hard to develop the professional capacity in people to be able to withstand the cultural gap that they're unable to bridge easily.
Well, if you run into people like that, and I've met people like that who've come back, and I've met other people, I would pull them out and put in 10,000 people like you.
Yeah.
If indeed there's any reason to be there at all. Now, you also served in Bosnia. That has been a reasonable success in the sense that people aren't getting killed.
Yeah.
But it's going to take a long time to sort that out. And that is an easy situation compared to Afghanistan. Now, we do have an interest in Bosnia because it is in Europe. And if we and the Europeans can't get Bosnia and Herzegovina, which goes with it, and the rest of Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, right, people are going to wonder about whether we can do anything right in Europe. But out in Afghanistan, if things went sour out there, it would take a while to figure out what's the matter. What do we have to worry about? We didn't worry about it before there was 9/11. The fact was that even though the 9/11 attack was based by a tiny group of people out of Afghanistan, most of them were actually Saudis, and a lot of the planning was done by people in Saudi Arabia, not government, but by other people. But it just happened to be, as a nation, we were so shocked, traumatized by 9/11 that we went into Afghanistan, didn't at that time manage to get Osama bin Laden, but then we stayed instead of getting out. We broke it, and then we decided to stay instead of just getting out. And a lot of us supported at the time. I can't say I was any different at the time. But after 18 years, you got to say, maybe it didn't work.
Right.
Let me give you an early historical example. In the War of Spanish-American War, 1898, one of the things we did is we went into the Philippines and got rid of the Spanish, and then we fought a guerrilla war for 13 years because the Filipinos didn't want us around either.
Yeah.
And we didn't learn the lesson there. We didn't learn it in Vietnam, and we haven't learned it in Afghanistan. We haven't learned it in Libya. And it's not just us. There are a lot of other countries who make similar mistakes. But we should be smart enough to start with the premise, what is the question, what is in America's fundamental interest, and then work from there. And then you add your human rights and other things to it. You don't neglect them, but you don't start with as your premise. But you also don't throw it overboard at the beginning.
Hey, this is Pete A. Turner from Lions Rock Productions. We create podcasts around here. And if you, your brand, or your company want to figure out how to do a podcast, just talk to me. I'll give you the advice on the right gear, the best plan, and show you how to take a podcast that makes sense for you, that's sustainable, that's scalable, and fun. Hit me up at pete@breakitdownshow.com. Let me help. I want to hear about it.
But you also don't throw it overboard at the beginning.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. The whole, why are we there? What is in our interest? So when we go to a place like Iraq, well, I guess we'll just say questionable legal authority to do that. What's a guy like you thinking? Like, if you're an ambassador and that's in, I mean, you've done work in the Middle East, so you have got a pretty good perspective. We should say that going in. If you're the ambassador of to Iraq or to a regional, to Jordan even, because everything's going through that, or Turkey, there's a lot of responsibility being put on you for this conflict. How does that impact your ability to do your job on a day-to-day basis?
Well, let me take a step sideways here. I can talk to you a lot about what ambassadors do in that part of the world, but I've only been an ambassador actually in one place for 4.5 years, and that was to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in Brussels. And quite frankly, I think during that period, we were very successful. Basically, my experience has been in the U.S. government in Washington. I worked for a year in the Johnson White House on education. I spent 4 years in the Jimmy Carter White House and the National Security Council staff. The first 2 years in charge of Europe, the second 2 years in charge of the Middle East. And there was doing what one calls policy making, figuring out what is the best thing for the United States to do, and to think at the presidential level, not at the State Department or Defense Department level, but how should the President of the United States be making those decisions? And most of the rest of my work has been on that. So I think that's where you have to start, which is at the presidential level, the Washington level, and ask the questions, what's the best thing to do for the United States? Now, by the time it gets down to ambassadors, a lot of very, very smart people will send messages back to Washington and say, I know what you're saying, but I want to let you know what's going on here.
Yeah.
Or I hope when you came back and you were able to go to Washington and talk to people and say, look, I know what you're telling your folks out there to do, but let me tell you, you don't have your head screwed on right. You got to do things differently. And I hope people listen to you, but very often they don't. And I think this is where the real problem is. It's what I have a term for it. I call it strategic thinking. What is the best thing for the United States to be doing in our interest? Who should we be working with? What should we be trying to accomplish? And only then say, now we figured that out, how do you try to accomplish it? What are the best tools? They're political, they're economic, they're military, they're informational, there's the public sector, there's the private sector. How do you look at this all? I'm going to use a very big word now, which is very popular in this town. It's called holistic approach. How do you get all the tools working together? So it's not just one group going out and doing their thing. Ambassadors play, in my judgment, a critical role as negotiators and as conduits for information and understanding, but they don't set the policy. I know very few ambassadors who have also been good policymakers. Whether you liked him or not, Henry Kissinger could do both. He could figure out what needed to be done. He could also figure out the tactics to get things done. But there are very few people who can do both. And we have good policymakers, we have wonderful diplomats, but very rarely are they the same people.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think you're right. And
We have
it's
people
funny.
like you.
Yeah.
We have people like you who, when you come back, if I'd been in government when you came back and I knew of you, I would sit you down and wherever I was working in the government, and I'd say, tell me what I need to know. Not what I'm going to tell you what you need to. You tell me what I need to know. Tell me where we're getting it wrong. And then give me your ideas of what we can do to get it right. That's what I'd look for.
Yeah, when you said that to Rich and I after our talk, who are we talking to in Washington? And we both laughed, because we've tried our hardest to get a hold of someone. I've talked to my Congress people, and I've written them letters, and they apparently do not care. So it's really, really hard because we do have valuable lessons on the things that we could do better. Like if in fact we're trying to create capacity to build at least a fledgling state in Afghanistan or even Iraq, then the way we're going about it won't work because we're just not creating the capacity that is being briefed to hire. And we
in
saw this.
1991, the United States went into Kuwait and partly into Iraq because Saddam Hussein had invaded and occupied Kuwait, and it was in the essential American and Western national and international interest to get the Iraqis out of Kuwait, because otherwise Saudi Arabia could have been next, and also the global energy supply was at grave risk, not just strategically, but also in terms of price and that sort of thing. And I think George H.W. Bush was wise to stop the fighting when he did, because he understood, which his son didn't understand, if you go into Iraq and you occupy it, you're stuck with it. Colin Powell had a wonderful saying which supplies someplace. He said he called it the Pottery Barn rule. If you break it, you own it.
Yeah.
Now, 2003, a bunch of people were in charge in American foreign policy. They got given those jobs because when George H.W. Bush won the presidency, we didn't have anything to do. We'd won the Cold War. We weren't in Iraq. That was all over. Right. And so he allowed a bunch of ideologues to get the major jobs, and they were just playing around, and they already decided they wanted to invade Iraq because that's kind of what they wanted to do. Then we had 9/11, and suddenly these were the people in charge of power. They had the levers of power. And so immediately, literally, and it's all on the public record, the day after 9/11, they were starting to think about how do we invade Iraq. It's all on the public record. And so this small group of people working with the president, with all due respect to George W. Bush, had literally been outside the United States, except to go to Mexico, 3 times in his entire life for a combined total of about 1 month. He knew nothing about the world, nothing. And so these characters decided they were going to drive us into Iraq. We all know who they were. And they got a bunch of things going about Iraqi nuclear weapons, which when we got there we found didn't exist. They built a head of steam with the American media was complicit and everybody, and we went into Iraq, which has turned out to be one of the, let's say, 3 stupidest things we have done in the last century. One was not joining the League of Nations. The second was Vietnam. And third was the invasion of Iraq, from which we are still suffering, and which was the fundamental cause of everything, all the problems in the Middle East today, with the exception of, leave aside Afghanistan, it's not in the Middle East, leave aside the Arab-Israeli conflict, which was going on, but everything in Syria, everything in Iraq, everything in Turkey, and all of that we're having a problem with, and with the Saudis, and with terrorism, and with Al-Qaeda, and the Islamic State, all of that derived from the absolute stupidity of the United States invading Iraq in 2003 and ending up owning it. And we hadn't a clue what we were doing. People we sent out there in the occupation force hadn't a clue. They didn't even know where Iraq was. They didn't speak Arabic. They took young people who'd been in the political campaign, sent them out there. One person was put in charge of the Iraqi stock market, who didn't even know what a stock market was. And we have suffered ever since. Lots of lives and trillions of dollars down a rat hole.
Do you remember when the provincial authority also invented a new flag for Iraq?
I'm sorry?
Do you remember when Bremer and his crew invented a new Iraqi flag?
Well, I'm sure that was true. Now, let me give you a basic lesson.
Yeah.
I've had the good fortune of being an academic in this stuff, but also I've had a lot of hands-on in important issues. When I was in the White House with Carter, we had a lot of very critical issues regarding nuclear weapons, regarding Soviet threat to Iran after it invaded Afghanistan. I had a major role, but not a critical role, in the Iranian hostage crisis. This was big stuff. And I sat in a lot of the meetings in the White House Situation Room with the great panjandrums, the great poobahs. A lot of them are very talented. Some of them were not so talented. And I came up with a rule, which is if you want to know just about anything happening in the outside world, there's somebody in the U.S. government, State Department, Defense Department, Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, was a lot of very intelligent people. Somebody in the U.S. government probably knows about it, except what Dictator X is going to have for breakfast tomorrow morning. And there's a two-step process. Number one, finding that person or those people when you're working in the White House, and then getting people to listen to him or her. And the second part is much harder. You came back from Afghanistan. You were one of the people who knew what was going on. You needed to be listened to. You weren't. And that I consider a cardinal sin of American foreign policy.
Yeah, I agree.
When I was in the White House, and the president would be having a meeting with a foreign leader, and we had to prepare the briefing memo for the president. What do you do with this president? And I'd get the stuff from the State Department, Defense Department. I'd look at it, and I'd say, this is pablum. This is junk. So what I would do is I would call up a mid-level person in the State Department. It's called a desk officer or a country director, right? And I'd call him up and I'd say, tell me, Charlie, what does the president need to know about the leader who's in your area of expertise so that he'll know what to say to foreign Prime Minister so-and-so? He said, well, what I would do is say 1, 2, 3, 4. And I said, that sounds great. How come it was not in the memo that was signed by the Secretary of State that came to us in the White House? He said, I tried, and it got knocked out of the memo. Uh-huh. Well, so John Kennedy, when he was president, used to call desk officers, and that would cause all kinds of consternation. He was the president calling the people who knew what needed to be known.
Sure.
So the system, in that sense, is broken.
Who's been the most recent powerhouse in terms of foreign policy? I mean, you had to talk about Kissinger. That's almost 50 years ago now. So has anybody in the last 40 years really had their hands wrapped around what good foreign policy was?
Well, at that level, the only other person I can think of was Zbigniew Brzezinski, who I happened to work for 4 years in the White House. Now, again, Brzezinski and Kissinger had different views of the world, and sometimes they were right and sometimes they were wrong, but both of them knew how to think about things. Then they had another national security advisor named Brent Scowcroft, who happened to be a lieutenant general in the Air Force, but he had spent a lot of time in the White House. He himself was not a great brain in foreign affairs, but he hired good people. That's what's important. Now I'm going to say something else that's going to curl your hair. In my judgment, you probably already figured out I'm a Democrat, right?
That's fine, though. Let's keep going.
All right, you probably figured that out. Although American foreign policy has to be bipartisan, because the problems out there are not problems about whether you're a Republican or Democrat. In other countries couldn't care whether you have a Republican or Democrat involved. You have to be able, as a nonpartisan basis, if you're any good at this business, to do it without respect to domestic politics. Okay, so the last person who became president of the United States, who knew what he was doing the day he became president was, and since I'm a Democrat, you'll understand who I'm going to say, George H.W. Bush. The four succeeding presidents didn't have a clue about foreign policy when they took office. Some of them were better than others. The ones who were the good ones hired good people.
Yeah.
The ones who didn't, and I've already talked about George W. Bush, who didn't think he needed a foreign policy, so he gave the jobs to a bunch of ideologues, right-wing ideologues. Obama came in. He didn't have a clue, and so he gave it to the people who were lining up to take jobs. And in fact, at one point, Obama gave a very important interview to the Atlantic magazine, and he said, you know, it's funny. Every time I ask a question, somebody comes up with a military solution. Oh, that's not what it is. And in fact, he gave a speech at West Point at one point in which he said, the problem we have with the military is they see a nail, and the only tool they have is a hammer, so they use a hammer to hit the nail. The problem was he never did anything about it. He didn't fire the failures who worked for him and hire good people. The same with George H.W. Bush. And Bill Clinton had a lot of good people, but a lot of the people he had weren't so good and didn't know how to think strategically about foreign policy problems. His second Secretary of State, who was very effective at self-promotion, didn't know very much about foreign affairs. Hillary Clinton, God bless her, wanted to be Secretary of State to check a block so she could run for president. She didn't hire good people. Fortunately, John Kerry, when he became secretary, hired a lot of good people, but then he didn't do as much as he needed to do. And of course, under this administration, we don't have a lot of good people anywhere. The current Secretary of State won't even defend the people who work for him, and he hasn't bothered making sure the best people in the State Department get promoted. So he's a joke around both in the government of people who know something and around the world.
Yeah. And also, you can be great at foreign policy and still have it all go wrong because, you know, everybody else in the world has a say in your policy and how it goes. So even someone like George H.W., who was maybe among the most qualified presidential candidates ever, you know, heck, so was Herbert Hoover. And Hoover had been all over the world, and timing just did not favor those guys, you know?
The interesting thing, the only president we had in the 20th century who did not sustain a single combat fatality.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting thing to think about.
That's crazy.
His failure was domestic economics, but in terms of foreign policy, he literally rescued Belgium during the First World War with a massive food program that at one point, which he ran, which at one point was feeding 1/3 of all the people in the Kingdom of Belgium, It was a fantastic achievement. Well, the basic thing is presidents need to know what they don't know. They need to hire good people. They need to find somebody who can tell them who the good people are and get rid of the dodos. But that's very rarely done nowadays. All right, let me give you another little thing on this, which matters much to me. During the Cold War, we knew we had to have smart people around because the consequences if we didn't could be humankind's final war, a nuclear war, and it would have ended everything. We had confrontation with the Soviet Union all over the place. We had people understood what we had to do, and our allies understood they had to follow American leadership. Then the Cold War comes to an end. We were number one in the world. We had more power and influence, at least potentially, watch the word potentially, than any other country had ever had since the end of the Roman Empire. Nobody could rival us. But then we squandered it. Instead of bringing in good people to say, now what do we do? And what about all these countries and the allies who no longer have to follow exactly what we want because they're scared to death of the big bad wolf out there called the Soviet Union? And what about all these other countries in the Middle East and elsewhere who got minds of their own, interests of their own? Why do we get the very best people in America together to figure this out? We didn't do it. We said, we don't have to think about the outside world. And we went through what I called a holiday from history. between what I say, I didn't invent this, somebody else did, but I steal other people's ideas. Between the two 9/11s, okay? We know what our 9/11 was, okay? That's 2001. The Europeans, God bless them, write their dates backwards from us. And so 9/11 for them was November the 9th, 1989, the day the Berlin Wall fell. And between the end of the Cold War and 9/11 in 2001, we thought we didn't have to have a foreign policy very much. We could tinker a little bit here, a little bit there. And we certainly didn't have to think very deeply about it, which was stupid.
Yeah.
And suddenly on 9/11, we realized that we could not just count on a renewal of the safety provided by the two broad oceans, which we had until December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese came to us. Well, Al-Qaeda came to us on 9/11, and we suddenly woke up to the idea we were going to have a solid foreign policy. And by then, we'd wasted a whole generation of not thinking seriously about it. Yeah, we had all kinds of think tanks and that sort of thing. People think about the tactics, but a lot of it was people getting in line to get a job during the next administration, rather than saying, I got to earn my way by being very smart. And we sidelined a lot of the smart people, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Your case in point, you came back, nobody would listen to you. Well, that, again, I'll say it again, not just about you, but by other people in your position, was a cardinal sin. It was stupid, and we're paying the price for it now.
Was there a path post 9/11 that George Bush, or heck, even Al Gore, right, because he damn near became president himself, like if you were sitting there and you're advising the president, like you said, we didn't know Arabic. We didn't know what Islam was. We didn't know what a Shiite or a Shia Muslim was from a Sunni or a Fiver or a Twelver. We didn't know that stuff at all. And here comes this conflict.
Most people wouldn't even know what you're talking about.
Right. So what would have been a better solution? I mean, I understand that going to Iraq hasn't worked out, but was there a good solution to that problem?
If George W. Bush had called me in, he wouldn't have. I was a Democrat, and getting jobs in foreign policy is amazingly competitive. In domestic, there are hundreds and hundreds of jobs, and there are 15 or 20 members of cabinet, but in foreign policy, everybody wants to be Secretary of State. And part of that is keeping out other people. It's very competitive. You have to be a Kissinger who says, I'm not going to allow people to play that game on me. I'm going to hire the best people. And he did. Brzezinski said the same. I'm going to hire the best people. Leaving present company accepted, that's me. He went on and hired amazingly good people. Scowcroft had hired amazingly good people. I would have said to George W. Bush, number one, you got to hire good people.
Right.
And the way I would do it, and I recommend this to every presidential candidate I have a chance to advise, and one thing I have to say is, in my own defense, is I have written speeches for more candidates for president of the United States than anybody else in U.S. history, 13 of them. That includes 3 presidents and 3 vice presidents, et cetera, and a bunch of losers. But that's okay. We'll leave that aside. And so, number one, I get somebody who doesn't have any stake in holding a job, somebody you trust, who just wants to do the best for the country, and send him or her out, beat the Bushes, and find out who's really good, and then come out with a list and give that to the president, and to compare that with a list that the establishment gives him, and there might be a couple of people on both lists, but I doubt it. That's number one. Number two, say, I want state, and I want the CIA and others, before I face a problem, get me something and get my people something, what they need to know before I do something stupid.
Right.
I happen to believe right now, another thing, here comes another lesson, which we do not follow the old adage, politics stops at the water's edge. Of course it doesn't. We have domestic politics involved in all kinds of foreign affairs. For example, one of the biggest problems we had in the 40s and 50s, and up until beginning of the 1970s, was the so-called China lobby, who said, who lost China? Well, of course, China wasn't for ours to lose. They had their own thing. But a lot of people, the State Department was largely destroyed by Joe McCarthy and others because his argument was, if it weren't for all these communists in the State Department, we would not have lost China. Well, one, there weren't any communists, maybe one or two, Alger Hiss and a couple of others, but China wasn't ours to lose.
Yeah.
They had their own internal civil war going on, and it didn't come out the way we would have hoped, but Chiang Kai-shek was a turkey, just as bad as some of the others. Okay, that was a case in which the United States foreign policy was challenged, and it took a man called Nixon, who had been part of the China lobby, very active part of the China lobby, to figure out strategically, and he did it by himself, not with Kissinger. Kissinger was just the errand boy on this, frankly. He was the guy that Nixon hired to keep people at Harvard quiet, all right? He happened to be very smart, but that's another matter. Nixon was the real creator of Nixon administration foreign policy. Nobody gives him credit for it because he got disgraced and he had to leave, and nobody liked Nixon anyway. But he figured out that if we were going to deal with the Soviet Union effectively, we were going to have to get China back in the balance. He also figured out, though a lot of people died in the process, Americans died in the process, plus others, if we're going to end the Vietnam War, we have to get China involved on our side, balancing the Soviet Union. So when we get out of Vietnam, it won't just be a victory for the Soviet Union and cause us real problems in the confrontation with the Soviet Union. We'd have China in play. And it took a guy who'd been in a part of the China lobby. Okay. Now, I will also say that when it comes to the Middle East, we have to deal always with the Israel lobby. Everybody knows that. We also have to deal with the Arab lobby, the Saudi Arabia, and all of that. Everybody knows that. I mean, that's a fact of life. And you deal with that, and you deal with it very effectively, which means if you want to do something useful, you have to, with regard to Israel, you have to get the Israel lobby on our side, which is what happened with the Camp David Accords. There was an awful lot of effort that went in to make sure that the Israel lobby knew that we weren't going to be selling out Israel. In fact, we got for Israel, Jimmy Carter did, the greatest strategic achievement in all of Israel's history was to take Egypt out of the military balance against Israel, which means that since then, no coalition of Arab states can even think about invading Israel. Can't be done. There can be terrorism, there can be what Iran does, what Hezbollah does, what other people do, but that's nothing compared to the 1956 war and the 1967 war. Just can't happen. With regard to Iran today, an awful lot of what's going on is not only of what the Ayatollahs do and still try to promote the Islamic Revolution, which their version of it, which nobody wants. Nobody out there, not in a single other country does anybody want it. They tried and it failed. But to please countries that don't, that want to use American confrontation against Iran in order to gain other things they want. And here it comes. This gets very complicated very quickly, but if you don't understand this, you don't understand nothing. Since we invaded Iraq, like it or not, this was a country where a Sunni minority ruled a country which had a Shia majority plus the Kurds. When we broke Iraq apart, suddenly there was a Shia majority oppressing not just the Kurds, once again, everybody oppresses the Kurds, but also the Sunni minority. So then it became very important for Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and some others to try to get their own back. This is why there was the great intervention against Syria, which, if I can confuse everybody, is a country with with a lot of different groups there, but essentially a Sunni majority country with a Alawite, which is a branch of Shiism, minority running it. And so getting rid of the Assad's family, and particularly this Assad, was important in order to have a Sunni-dominated counterweight to the new Shia-dominated Iraq. Okay? And one of the errors we have committed in all of the years of the civil war in Syria, and where we have been backing people trying to get rid of the Assads, we have never said, how are we going to ensure that when that changes, if it changes, there will not be a Sunni bloodbath against the Alawites. We never addressed that issue. And that's one reason they all hang on. Okay. And being against the Iranians is part of that because it's a Shia country. Now, who do we have a different relationship with Iran? I don't know, because you've got a bunch of Ayatollahs there who want to, and the Revolutionary Guard Corps who want to stay in power. And one way of staying in power is to having the great Satan as an enemy and being anti-Israel, because they think that appeals to the popular opinion in much of the Arab world, which is anti-Israel. Okay, so that happens. So our biggest error there, after the Obama administration negotiated, God, am I losing your audience here? The joint
No, you're fine, man.
Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which took Iran out of the nuclear weapons business. Whether they were going for nuclear weapons or anyone, who knows, but it took them out of that business for at least 10 to 15 years. They destroyed their nuclear reactor that was making plutonium. They sent 90% of their enriched uranium they sent out of the country. And then Donald Trump comes along. He had run for president saying, oh, the JCPOA was the dumbest thing ever done in history. It was actually one of the smartest things that was done. It was one of the best things done for Israel. And Mr. Netanyahu wanted to keep power, even though he may actually end up going to prison. But he saw an opportunity to build with his right wing, and also to appeal to the right wing parts of the Israel lobby here, which is not the majority of Jewish Americans at all. A lot of them are evangelicals. In fact, the majority of Jewish Americans supported this effort to prevent Iran from getting the bomb through the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. So Trump comes in, he abrogates American participation in it, which was not quite as stupid as our invading Iraq, but incredibly stupid. And it has meant that the chances of working something out with the Iranians went to zero. And we are now in a position of imposing added sanctions against Iran, to try to achieve what we'd already achieved with the agreement we struck with Iran. And every other country that was part of that agreement, the British, the French, the Germans, the European Union, the Chinese, and the Russians want to keep that agreement going, and have been pushing the Trump administration not to be so craven as Trump has been. But you can't get Trump to do anything intelligent if he's got his own kind of interest in going a different direction. And that's causing us a lot of damage. On top of which we are supporting the Saudis in their intervention in Yemen, which the Saudis have been trying to do since 1962. Okay, so as an oldie but goodie, that war wouldn't be continuing if it weren't for American and British military support for Saudi Arabia, which has killed thousands and thousands of people, civilians mostly. Right. That war would come to an end if we weren't supporting Saudi Arabia, partly to help Saudi Arabia make up for what we did in Iraq. On top of which, let me give you one other little fact that we ignore. We talk about Iran's support for terrorism. Pompeo says Iran is the world's leading supporter of terrorism. It's not true. The world's leading supporter of terrorism by far is Saudi Arabia, or at least people in Saudi Arabia who are tolerated by the government. Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, Boko Haram in Africa, all of these, the people running who did what they did to us on 9/11, all of these got their inspiration and a lot of financial support from people in Saudi Arabia. But no American politician has the guts to stand up and say so and tell the Saudis to cut it out. In fact, it wouldn't even be on our radar except that last year, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, who runs the show there now, didn't get a little bit out ahead of himself and ordered the slaughter of a journalist named Adnan Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, which incidentally, all of this is on tape. the Turks were taping what was going on in that embassy. And Adnan Khashoggi was not just an ordinary journalist who opposed the regime in Riyadh. He happened to be a stringer for the Washington Post.
Yeah.
And that's why we suddenly became concerned about that. If he killed some other journalist or somebody who wasn't a journalist, we wouldn't care at all. But the fact he took on somebody in a leading American newspaper, I would say, it's a terrible thing to say, in terms of our Middle East policy, if anybody in the last couple of years did not die in vain, it was Khashoggi, because it's now helped to wake people up here that American foreign policy in the Middle East for many, many years now has not been made in Washington. It's been made by countries who are our friends and partners in the Middle East because, to a great extent, of American domestic politics. Now, I'm going to get in deep trouble for stating that truth. Everybody who works in the business in this town knows that to be a truth, but it is catastrophic for one's political career to say so.
Yeah, well, does it make it not true? And guys like us, we live on the truth. This is the reality. You can choose to ignore it, but it's going to keep beating you every day, And
well, that is a relatively minor issue, quite frankly. We've been there 18 years. We've spent $3 or $4 trillion. We've lost a few thousand American lives. But, and this is going to sound cynical, but it's the way politics work. Because we don't have the draft, only about 1% of Americans go into the military. Not that many Americans know somebody who gets killed when they get killed, So we as a society tolerate that. It was different from Vietnam when we had the draft. We lost 58,000 lives, and everybody was worried that one of their relatives might get sent off to Vietnam to get killed, and so we had protests. We don't have any protests in regard to the Middle East. Now I'm going to come back to something else.
Yeah.
Domestic politics, which is what is going on right now with impeachment. By the time your people hear this broadcast, there is a very good chance that the House of Representatives will have voted articles of impeachment, which will then take the case of Mr. Trump to the United States Senate for a trial, which is the way the Constitution works. How long that trial will take, I have no idea. Some people want it to be short, some people want it to be long, but the outcome of that trial, unless Trump does something now much more egregious than anything he's already done, is he'll be acquitted. The votes just aren't there with the Republicans. In fact, I would say, as somebody who I detest Trump. I think he's easily the worst president we've ever had. The damage he's caused in this country, the damage he's caused to America abroad is incalculable. Some is reversible, some is not. American standing in the world would take years and years to restore. And there are things in this country that, for example, the damage to the environment that would mean never reverse. And we are also losing time, critical time, on dealing with what is the number one problem facing the United States, bar none, which is climate change. And it may already be too late, but there's nothing to compare with that. And we have a president who's working the other way, and this, well, that's another matter. But okay, yeah. So the whole Russia thing that's going on, and I believe Russia did interfere in elections. Was it decisive? I think it's ludicrous. The idea that enough Americans were swayed by Russian propaganda to vote for Trump and against Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton ran a lousy campaign, and the coastal elites, and I'm sorry if you were on the West Coast, so you may fit into that, the contempt for a lot of people in the middle of this country, the absolute contempt. Hillary Clinton said, and you can look it up, I looked it up just the other day, most of the people who support Trump, I put in a basket of deplorables.
Yeah.
That's about 15 million Americans she's calling deplorable. Well, no wonder people voted against her. Okay. So people are now saying Trump is terrible. We have to get rid of him. People were starting to talk about impeaching him even before he was inaugurated. Fine, that's their thing. But they have two things to hang it on. Number one, the Russians elected Hillary. And then number two, they said, oh, Trump has got a bromance with Putin and all this kind of stuff. And so this is a great cudgel to try to get rid of Trump. So, and I will now say, one of the few, I believe, good things that Trump has done in foreign policy is understand, as some of his predecessors have understood, beginning with George H.W. Bush, followed by Bill Clinton, and I think the others sort of understood this as well who came afterwards, is we have to deal with Russia in the future. We have no choice. It was not forever going to be kept. The old line was Guatemala with nuclear weapons. George H.W. Bush proclaimed what he called the grand strategy of trying to create a Europe whole and free and at peace, and included Russia. And one reason he did it is he looked back and he saw what happened with Germany at the Treaty of Versailles when it was forced to accept full responsibility for World War I, which was nonsense. Hitler came along and he used this very effectively as propaganda. George H.W. Bush said, wait a second, Russia again will get back at its feet, and we don't want the Russians to say we kicked them when they were down. Okay, so our current president understood, like his predecessors, we got to do something not to kick Russia when it's down. But the political establishment in the Democratic Party said, oh, no. Anything he does with Russia must be because he did something with Russia which was terrible, or he loves Putin more than America. And in fact, when he met Putin at Helsinki, the media said, oh, Trump took Putin's word regarding the meddling in the 2016 elections over the word of our intelligence community. That's not what Trump actually said. Look it up on the web. He said, I have full confidence in the American intelligence community, but Putin made a strong case for his point of view. The media immediately said, oh, he took Putin's position over us. They weren't willing to read or have read the full transcript. In fact, at that meeting, given what Putin said, there were a number of positive ideas, one of which is arms control. A year and a half from now, the fundamental arms control relationship between the United States and Russia on strategic weapons expires.
Wow.
And it is very, very important for American national interests to be able to renegotiate that treaty. Well, right now it's not possible because American domestic politics won't let it. Then, in one of the wonders of wonders, when that wasn't going so well for American domestic politics, they discovered this thing in Ukraine. Well, I think what Trump supposedly did on his phone call on July 25th, I think that's highly reprehensible. It is a crime. Whether it's enough to throw him out of the presidency, I'm going to let other people decide that. I don't want him as president. I want him to be voted out of office next year because he's not going to get thrown out by the impeachment process. It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
But the thing was, in my judgment, it wasn't, here came this Ukraine thing, this phone call, and that leads to impeachment. It was, we're looking for something to hang impeachment on, and this happened to come along the road. Right. I suspect the average American, most Americans look at that, this Ukraine thing, and they say, what the heck is that?
Yeah.
And I don't think that's, and in fact, I'm not so sure the whole impeachment thing is going to help defeat Trump at the polls next year, which is
it might actually make him too. It might make him the president because I got to be honest. I'm sick of hearing from legislators who are running for president that they're going to hear what I'm going to do when I'm president. Like, do it now, build a consensus and pass laws. Because I'm highly critical of Congress. You know, they don't.
Immigration is a congressional problem. Why haven't they dealt with it if it's so important? You know, like get out there and get together and build consensus and solve problems. If not, don't tell me you're going to make
Healthcare, education, where Trump is getting away with an education secretary who doesn't believe in public schools.
Yeah.
So that's ought to be what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Not about. In fact, I'm not sure about this, but I'm kind of thinking that when Trump looks at the impeachment process and then the trial in the Senate, he's saying, like Brer Rabbit, please don't throw me in that briar patch. I think his polling probably shows just what you said, the average American, that dog won't hunt. That's why I want to see the Democrats focus on nominating a solid candidate for president who will talk about in solid terms that will appeal to the broad mass of Americans about immigration, about healthcare, about education, about you name it.
Yeah.
The thing is, put food on the table and safety in the streets and an education for their children and healthcare for the average American, which is what most Americans most care about.
Well, listen, that was a barn-burning hour. Man, what a fantastic show that's going to make for everybody. I really appreciate you coming on, Robert, and hope that we can have you come on again, because we could do all of that again and not talk about any of those things, and I'm sure just have another great discussion.
Well, it's my honor. My basic lesson is presidents need to hire good people and do strategic thinking at the presidential level that will meet America's interests in the outside world.